Booktube. I'm here to introduce a new series that I want to start on my channel. I made a video a while ago about genre and terminology and why I think it's important for readers and writers to know about these things. And I decided to explore genres on my channel as a series to kind of introduce people to the ideas of them. Now, they're going to be constructed in certain ways. I'm going to kind of explore, first of all, what the genre means, discuss themes and tropes within the genre, and recommend some lesser known books from that genre. Now, these videos are just to be scratching the surface. If I was really to delve into these genres, the videos would be incredibly long, and talking like hours. There's so much discussion going on around genre, but I'd really like to get discussions going. We can go in the comments and we can debate and talk and recommend books if you want to recommend books. And I'll put some links in the description bar that will guide you to further reading on the topic. So I'm going to begin with fantasy. Yeah, why not? What is fantasy? It's magic, it's dragons, it's medieval era settings, is that right? Maybe. One of my favorite definitions of fantasy actually comes from Farah Mendleton. She's the author of Rhetorics of Fantasy. I'll put that in the description bar down below. She believes that fantasy is a dialect between author and reader which constructs a sense of wonder and belief. Beautiful. But more generally, fantasy can be thought of as a work of literature that uses magic or supernatural aspects as a primary plot element. Now, people tend to argue that there are two subgenres of fantasy, high fantasy and low fantasy, and these subgenres used to be clearly defined, but now there are so many books that bridge the two genres, the two subgenres, that it's now necessary, I think, to designate new ones, start using new terms. So instead of high and low fantasy, which used to have prescriptions for characters, themes, and even morality, we're now going to use the terms epic and contemporary. Yeah, these two genres, basically the difference between them is the world setting. Easy, right? Epic fantasy is epic. Obviously. The world that it takes place in is generally not on Earth. It's enormously detailed, not just in its geography, but also in its backstory, because there's usually like a mythology or some sort of history attached to it. The use of magic is very prevalent. It is well known. There's fantastical creatures that aren't necessarily hidden, and the stories themselves are epic, spanning several books, usually. Some examples of epic fantasy are Lord of the Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire series. Contemporary fantasy, the other subgenre, is fantasy that takes place in our world and where magic isn't so prevalent. So, for example, Harry Potter and the Artemis Fowl series are both considered contemporary fantasies. These subgenres allow for the overlapping elements that were once just expected in either high or low fantasy. So let's explore some tropes that is common in fantasy. Some people would argue that in fantasy the morals tend to be straightforward. Good versus evil. As we see in, say, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Aslan and the Pevensey children are good and the White Witch is bad. Or in Harry Potter, where Harry Potter is good and Voldemort is evil. However, a closer look at fantasy, since, say, the times of King Arthur, not the times of, but the story of King Arthur, where we see the story, especially of Lancelot and Guinevere, where kind of Lancelot is seen as both a good and a bad character. You know, we see that kind of morality get complicated, and I think a lot of the readers are starting to appreciate that. We see it a lot more common in literature now. For example, in Song of Ice and Fire, majority of the characters have both good traits and evil traits in them, and it's not necessarily good triumphing over evil. Another typical trope within fantasy is that of characters. Characters in fantasy tend to be orphans, underdogs, generally people who have to overcome grand obstacles in order to save the world. There's generally something extraordinary about these characters that aid them in their quest. So for example, it could be a farmer boy from some backwater town that just happens to be able to use magic that only females generally are able to use, such as Rand in the Wheel of Time series, or a female wizard who happens to be the seventh daughter of a seventh son in a male-dominated field like Esk in Discworld's Equal Rights. There are lots more tropes, but the last one I'd like to share is world building. Specifically the placement of fantasy worlds in pseudo medieval era. This generally applies to epic fantasy. There are times when separate worlds within our world, seen in the contemporary fantasy, also follow this example. So for example in Harry Potter, the wizarding world is quite medieval-esque. They still live in castles. They don't have a lot of use for technology. They still wear robes and tall hats. Their economy is very medievally, etc., etc. So I believe that the influence of mythology and legends, which could be, I guess, considered the original fantasies, their influence on this literature is likely the reason for the setting, because it harkens back to a time when magic was more believable. I think it's important to note at this time that not all fantasy literature follows these tropes. These are just kind of common elements that you see across the board. It's important for genre and writing styles to evolve and develop with current trends, and we see that a lot in some of the newer fantasy. So for example, more recent fantasy novels haven't been taking place in the medieval world. They've been taking place in the Eastern world, or in the ancient world, or, you know, underwater or something, you know, where there's not just this one setting. It's now been broadened. So now I'd just like to give you some recommendations. Obviously I listed off a few of the more popular examples in the first part of the video, but here I'd like to give you some not so popular books, but books that I still think should be read in the fantasy genre. So first of all, there's King of Ys, which is a series I just recently got into this year. I'm almost done it. It's only 4 books. It's called the King of Ys series, YS, and it's written by Paul and Karen Anderson. It's about a Roman centurion who comes to this mystical city called Ys, and Ys is ruled by 9 witches. So there's a bit of a history element to it and a bit of a fantasy element to it. So we see this book bridging different genres here. The next one I'd like to recommend is The Unlikely Ones by Mary Brown. This is the story of the familiars of witches, which includes a human girl, a frog, I think there's even a fish, and a cat, and they go on an adventure. And lastly, I'd like to recommend Gormenghast, the whole trilogy, written by Mervyn Peake. This is a fantasy of manners. So you know how like there's the comedy of manners that generally Jane Austen gets placed into? Well, Gormenghast is a fantasy of manners, which more deals with characters than anything else. So let me know what you think the fantasy genre is, if you have any books that you'd like to recommend, if you have any ideas or any arguments against what I've said. Let's get a discussion going in the comments, and remember to keep on reading.